The town of Fenwhistle had a talent, honed across several centuries of practice, for deciding things were perfectly all right. The church tower leaned slightly, but measurably, and had done so since 1743. The war memorial spelled Corporal Hodges as Corporal Hodges, with a surplus sups that no subsequent generation had thought it polite to remove. The level crossing gate on Mill Lane opened a full 8 seconds later than the signal indicated, a discrepancy that every resident of the town had absorbed, without comment, into their working understanding of the universe. Gerald Pask, manager of the Fenwhistle branch of the Barminster and County Bank for 11 years, had died at his desk on a Tuesday afternoon, and Fenwhistle had decided, with its customary efficiency, that this was perfectly all right as well. Dr. Ambrose Pell had signed the certificate within the hour. Cardiac failure, he wrote in the handwriting that 30 years of prescriptions had rendered technically illegible but professionally authoritative. Mr. Pask had been 54, and a little overweight, and had eaten a great deal of cheese at the Rotary dinner only 10 days prior. There was, as Dr. Pell explained to the deputy manager on the day, really nothing puzzling about it. Men of that age and constitution were the very demographic that cardiac failure was designed for. The body had been removed. The family had been notified. The branch had remained closed on Wednesday as a mark of respect, though several customers had nonetheless tried the door at 11 o'clock, found it locked, checked their watches, and gone away mildly affronted. By Thursday, Fenwhistle had more or less filed the matter. It was on Friday morning that Inspector Walter Purbright received a telephone call from a man named Strickland, who was head of internal compliance at the Barminster and County Bank's regional office in Ipswich, and who seemed to feel that Fenwhistle's filing had been premature. "We received a letter," Strickland said, "from Mr. Pask, dated last Tuesday, the day he died." Purbright, who had been reviewing a report about a stolen lawnmower, set his pen down. "Postmarked Tuesday?" he asked pleasantly. "Postmarked Tuesday, yes. First post. Which means he must have sent it that morning before he came into work. The letter describes certain irregularities. In the accounts of a local charitable body, he was very specific. He named names, and the irregularities were significant." There was a pause in which Mr. Strickland clearly weighed the technical meaning of the word against the emotional one, and decided both applied. "Inspector, I want to be very clear. We are not suggesting anything improper about Mr. Pask's death. Dr. Pell is a well-regarded." "And yet," Purbright said, "you telephoned." Another pause. "Yes," said Strickland, with the relief of a man who has been talking around a sentence for 2 minutes and has finally found someone willing to finish it for him. "Yes, precisely." Purbright drove to Fenwhistle that same afternoon. He brought with him Sergeant Sidney Love, who was thorough and good-natured and who possessed an ability rare in any profession to take notes without appearing to do so. Love sat in the passenger seat with a folder on his knee and said, at roughly the halfway point, that it was a shame about the bank manager. "Is it?" said Purbright. "Well, dying at his desk. People die in worse places." "True," Love conceded. "My uncle went at the Greyhound track. 6th race. Did he win?" "He'd put money on the 4th. Purbright regarded this briefly in silence. Then perhaps it balanced out. The Barminster and County Bank occupied a solid Edwardian building on Market Square, its cream stucco front only slightly suited by the decades, its brass plate polished to a confidence that current interest rates did not entirely justify. Next door was the office of Featherby and Featherby solicitors, though as Love noted from the brass plate, there appeared to have been only one Featherby for some time. Across the square, the Fleece public house kept early hours with the quiet dignity of a building that knew it would still be there long after everything else had been repurposed into flats. Purbright parked without ceremony and sat for a moment looking at the square. A woman was walking a small dog with the resigned expression of someone who had long since accepted that she went where the dog decided. A man in a green wax jacket was removing a parking notice from his windscreen with the particular contempt of someone who considers himself personally exempt. Above the bank, a first-floor curtain twitched, very briefly, just once, then went still. "Someone up there," said Love. "Yes," said Purbright. He kept his eyes on the window, though that of course covers quite a range of possibilities. He opened the car door. "Let's begin with the ones that are easiest to eliminate." They crossed the square in thin October sunshine. Purbright slightly ahead, Love half a step behind with his notebook tucked away in his inside pocket, and the folder under his arm, and Fenwhistle, as it always did, with everything watched them from a careful and studiously uninterested distance. Number 14. Aldermere Road was the sort of house that guests always described, in well-meaning tones, as very well kept. The front path had been edged with a tool rather than a spade, the kind of fine distinction that only matters to those for whom it matters enormously. The brass knocker was shaped like a lion, and had been polished, Purbright estimated, within the last 24 hours. Grief, he reflected, was expressed in many ways, and cleaning was among the more honest of them. Mrs. Dorothea Pask answered the door before he had finished raising his hand to knock. She was a woman of perhaps 50, compact in both build and manner, wearing a pale blue cardigan that had almost certainly been selected, in some carefully unconscious way, as a compromise between mourning and not wishing to make a fuss. She looked at Purbright's warrant card with a thoroughness that suggested she had been expecting it, and perhaps had rehearsed what expression to wear when it arrived. "Inspector." She stepped back. "Do come in, both of you." The sitting room was immaculate. Purbright had attended enough bereavements, professionally and otherwise, to understand that the domestic environment of a new widow generally occupied one of two states: the preserved chaos of someone who could not bear to disturb a single object, or the aggressively restored order of someone who needed, above all things, to feel that they were managing. The Pask sitting room was emphatically the latter. Gerald Pask's armchair. Purbright assumed it had been his, from the position near the window, and the slight depression in the arm had been plumped so thoroughly that it looked as if no one had ever sat in it at all. On the mantelpiece, framed photographs stood at geometrically identical intervals. One had, Purbright noted, been recently repositioned. The dust on the shelf told a faint rectangular story about where it had previously stood. Mrs. Pask had settled herself near the window with a shallow clay pot of salmon-pink geraniums in her lap, a small pair of scissors in her right hand. She was deadheading them with the focused tranquility of someone engaged in a familiar and essentially soothing act, though every so often the scissors paused for just a fraction of a second too long. "I appreciate you seeing us," Purbright said, taking the chair she indicated. Love arranged himself unobtrusively near the door, notebook in his jacket, hands folded on his knee. "I understand this is a very difficult. Gerald died 4 days ago, Inspector." She snipped a Browning stem cleanly. "I find it's more useful to speak directly than to make an occasion of the difficulty." Purbright smiled with genuine appreciation. "Then I'll do the same. We've been asked by Mr. Pask's employer to make some inquiries about the circumstances of his death. It's a formality, largely, but one that requires us to speak to those who knew him best." "Largely," she repeated, not as a question. "Largely," he confirmed pleasantly. She held his gaze for a moment, then returned to the geraniums. "What would you like to know?" he asked her about Gerald's state of mind in the weeks before he died. She answered carefully, not evasively. Exactly, but with the measured precision of someone who had decided in advance which version of an answer to give. "He had been preoccupied," she said, "quieter than usual. He slept badly in the last fortnight, which was unlike him. Gerald had always been a man who went to bed at 10 and was unconscious by 3 minutes past." "Did he talk to you about work?" Purbright asked. "Gerald didn't talk about work as a rule. He thought it improper to bring the bank home." A small pause. "Though recently there had been a heaviness. I couldn't say more than that. A heaviness. You could see it in him, the way he read the newspaper without reading it, if you follow me, turning pages at the right intervals, but not actually taking anything in." She set the geranium pot down on the side table and began gathering the clipped stems into a small pile in her palm. "I asked him once. He said it was nothing I needed to concern myself with, so I didn't." The way she said it, not bitterly, not with resentment, but with the flat assurance of a statement that had long since ceased to require an emotion, told Purbright rather more than the words themselves. "Did anyone visit him at home in that period?" "Mr. Featherby called on the Monday evening." She said this without particular emphasis, in the same tone she might use to describe a change in the weather. "Oliver Featherby, the solicitor. They were in Gerald's study for about an hour. I brought them tea." "Did you hear any of their conversation?" "Naturally not. Gerald always closed the door." She permitted herself a mild expression. "I don't believe he thought I was in the habit of listening at keyholes. It was simply how he managed things." Separately, Love, near the door, wrote 2 words in his notebook in a hand so small it was essentially private. "And on the Tuesday, the morning he went into work for the last time," Purbright said, keeping his voice light and unhurried, "was there anything, a phone call, an errand, anything he did before he left?" Dorothea Pask was still for a moment. The geranium stems lay gathered in her palm. She seemed to be arriving at some interior threshold, examining it, and deciding not to cross it today. "He posted a letter," she said at last. "I saw him from the bedroom window. He went to the box at the end of the road himself, rather than leaving it for the collection. He was back before I came downstairs. Did you see who the letter was addressed to?" "No." She stood, crossed to the window, and tipped the dead stems into a small bin beside the radiator. "I only noticed because he was still in his dressing gown." She turned back to face Purbright, and something in her expression, not quite sadness, not quite fear, but a species of private reckoning, passed across her face and was gone. Gerald never went outside in his dressing gown, not once in 26 years. Outside, a blackbird was making an extraordinary noise in the pruned rose hedge for no particular reason. Neither Purbright nor Mrs. Pask mentioned it, but both for a moment listened. The Barminster and County Bank had reopened on Thursday, and by Friday afternoon had largely recovered its composure. The queue at the single open counter was short. The transaction sounds, the muted percussion of stamps and the whisper of paperwork had resumed their habitual rhythm, and any customer entering from the street would have had no particular reason to suppose that the man whose photograph still occupied a small silver frame on the wall beside the office door had died at that desk 3 days previously. This Purbright suspected was entirely intentional. Mr. Colin Hadstock, acting branch manager in the interim, met them in the small wood-panelled corridor behind the public counter with the expression of a man who has been helpful to the point of exhaustion and intends to continue regardless. He was somewhere in his late 30s, with the slightly urgent quality of someone who had been in Gerald Pask's professional shadow long enough to find its sudden removal both distressing and, in complicated ways he would never acknowledge, somewhat liberating. "Anything you need, Inspector, anything at all. The regional office has been very clear. Full cooperation." He said this twice, in slightly different arrangements of words, as though the first instance might not have taken. Should I ask Miss Crane to join us? She has 30 years here. Longer than I've been alive, technically." "I was aware of the arithmetic, yes," said Miss Crane, appearing from behind the counter as if she had simply always been standing there and they had only just noticed. "Good afternoon, Inspector Purbright." She was a woman of 58 whose entire bearing communicated that she had heard most things and been impressed by very few of them. Her hair was iron grey and firmly pinned. She wore a brooch in the shape of a swallow, which was the single decorative concession she appeared to have made to the idea that personal expression was permissible. She looked at Purbright in the way that experienced counter staff everywhere look at people whose requirements they have already assessed, fully, briefly, and with professional finality. They convened in Hadstock's, formerly Pask's, office. Miss Crane chose the chair nearest the door with the quiet authority of someone who has never needed to explain her preferences. Purbright asked about Tuesday, about Mr. Pask's afternoon. Hadstock leaned forward. "Mr. Featherby came in at 2:30. Oliver Featherby, the solicitor. He and Mr. Pask had a private appointment. On the diary, Miss Crane brought in tea," said Miss Crane. "I brought in a tray at 2:35. 2 cups. Did you stay?" Purbright asked her. "I did not. Mr. Pask preferred to manage his own hospitality once a visitor was settled." "And the tray, did you collect it afterwards?" A brief recalibration occurred behind Miss Crane's eyes. "Young Mr. Quelch collected it. He brings the trays back to the kitchen. That's his usual job." "When did Mr. Featherby leave?" "I heard the office door at approximately 3:10. She folded her hands on her knee. "I was attending to a customer. I didn't see him go." "But you heard the door." "I notice most things that happen in this building, Inspector. It would be poor professional practice not to." Hadstock, who had been listening with the expression of someone at a tennis match, saw his opening. There was also a telephone call. Mr. Pask had a call at Miss Crane. It was around 2 o'clock, wasn't it? The swallow brooch was presented in profile as Miss Crane turned, fractionally toward her colleague. It was not quite a look of reproach. It was more the expression of a woman privately revising her opinion of someone's discretion. "Councillor Tubb telephoned," she said, "at 2:05. The call lasted a short time. I was not party to it." "How long?" Purbright asked. 4 minutes, possibly 5. "Did Mr. Pask seem altered afterwards?" She considered the word altered with some care. "He seemed much as he had seemed for the preceding fortnight," she said, "which is to say, preoccupied." Purbright nodded slowly. He glanced around the office. At the desk, clear now of everything except Hadstock's borrowed stationery, At the glass panel in the door through which the main floor was faintly visible, at the window that faced the narrow back lane behind Market Square. "Miss Crane," he said, "Mr. Pask's last weeks. You've described him as preoccupied. Was there any particular area of the branch's business that seemed to be occupying him?" She did not answer immediately, which in itself was informative. "Gerald Pask," she said finally, "was conscientious about every area of this branch's business, without exception." "Without exception," Purbright agreed. "Were there any accounts he was reviewing more closely than others?" Another pause, shorter this time but more deliberate. "He asked me approximately 12 days before he died not to process any further transactions on the Fenwhistle Community Betterment Fund account until he gave me further notice." Hadstock looked up. He had evidently not known this. "Did he say why?" Purbright asked. "No." A perfect, clean syllable. She had lived inside it for 12 days, and was not going to embroider it now. "And since his death, has anyone else asked about that account?" The swallow brooch turned toward Purbright with the contained energy of a woman who was deciding in real time whether a particular fact qualified as one she was obliged to share. "Apparently it did. Mr. Featherby telephoned yesterday morning," she said. "He asked whether probate would affect the processing of charitable transactions. I said I wasn't aware it would. He thanked me and rang off." Love wrote in his notebook. The faint scratch of his pen was the only sound in the room for a moment. "Mr. Hadstock," said Purbright pleasantly, standing, "I'd like to look at the transactions on that account at some point, with the appropriate permissions arranged through your regional office." "Naturally." "Of course," Hadstock said, too quickly, which meant he would telephone Ipswich the moment they left. Miss Crane walked them back to the corridor. At the door to the main floor she paused and said, without particular inflection, "Mr. Pask was a good manager, more thorough than most people realized." She pushed open the door and returned to her counter before Purbright could respond. Out in the square, Love squinted into the pale afternoon light. "She knows more than she said." "She knows a great deal more than she said," Purbright agreed. "What interests me is that she chose to say exactly as much as she did, not less." He looked back at the brass plate on the bank door. "Miss Crane is not protecting herself. She's constructing something. Whether it's a case or a tribute, I couldn't yet tell you." Reginald Tubb was, by his own account and the general reluctant consensus of Fenwhistle, a man who got things done. He was chairman of the town council, patron of the Christmas Lights Committee, chair of the Fenwhistle Community Betterment Fund, and captain of the golf club 2 years running, a distinction he had achieved less through sporting merit than through the sheer cumulative weight of his presence at every meeting where such appointments were decided. He was large, ruddy and loud in the way that certain men are loud, not from insensitivity, but from an early and correct understanding that the world rewards projection. He was holding court at the bar of the Fenwhistle Golf Club when Purbright arrived, bracketed on either side by men in sweaters who were laughing at something he had apparently just said. The fire had been lit in the stone hearth despite the fact that it was only early October and not yet cold enough to justify it. A row of past captains regarded proceedings from their framed photographs with the combined expression of men who had all, in their time, said something they later regretted in exactly this room. "Inspector," Tubb extended a hand across the bar with the enthusiasm of a man greeting a long-awaited ally rather than a police officer. His handshake carried about 40% more pressure than was strictly conversational. "Dreadful business about Gerald Pask. Dreadful. Come and have a drink. Not on duty, surely. On a Friday. Tonic water would be very welcome," Purbright said, which was the answer that deflected the question without answering it. The men in sweaters redistributed themselves amiably. Love took a stool at the near end and accepted a tonic water of his own, with a nod of thanks to the young woman behind the bar, who had the expression of someone mentally composing a letter of resignation. Tubb had already leaned an elbow on the bar and composed his face into sorrow, which on his broad features looked, not quite convincingly, like a face that had been sorrow-adjacent and had done its best. 11 years that man ran our branch. 11 years. You wouldn't think, would you? I saw him Monday morning, as a matter of fact, into the bank for a routine matter. He seemed perfectly well, a little quiet perhaps, but Gerald was often quiet. Monday morning, Purbright said. So the day before he died. Is that significant? Tubb asked, with an openness so complete it took a moment to assess. Not necessarily, Purbright said. It's simply the kind of detail that's useful to have. What was the routine matter, if you don't mind my asking? Community Betterment Fund, paperwork mostly. Gerald liked things signed properly, never a corner cut, not one. I used to tease him about it. He shook his head in the gentle way of a man preserving an anecdote about someone recently deceased. Tremendous attention to detail. It sounds like an admirable quality in a bank manager. In a bank manager, absolutely, Tubb agreed, and laughed with the generosity of a man who has decided the statement is simply flattering, and not also something else. From a table near the window, a man named Brambling, who played off a handicap of 14, and had the leathery, wind-polished complexion of someone who had been outdoors in the wrong weather for 30 years, looked up from his crossword. "Wasn't there some bother with the Betterment Fund accounts recently, Reggie?" Someone was saying. "Colin Brambling," said Tubb, with a volume and cordiality that successfully annexed the sentence before it reached its destination, "has a remarkable talent for half a story. The accounts are in perfectly good order, Inspector. Audited every year. Oliver Featherby handles the legal side. First-rate man, Featherby. I expect you'll speak to him." "I expect I will," Purbright said pleasantly. Brambling returned to his crossword with the philosophical air of a man accustomed to being talked over. Purbright took a sip of tonic water and looked at the fire, which was doing its best against the indifference of the room. "The fund. It does impressive work locally, I gather." Tubb was immediately, visibly gratified. He described the fund's achievements with the enthusiasm of a man who had composed the list many times and never tired of delivering it. The new play equipment in Fenwick Park, the resurfaced car park behind the library, the annual bursary for a sixth-form student, the repairs to the bandstand roof. He had a statistic for each, rounded to a satisfying degree of precision. "And the fund is well supported?" Purbright asked. "Donations coming in regularly?" "Regularly and generously. We had a rather substantial anonymous donation come through in September, in fact. £22,000. He said this with the pride of a man announcing a personal achievement which was, Purbright thought, not entirely inaccurate. "Not unusual for us to receive gifts of that nature. The community believes in what we do." "Anonymous donors," Purbright said. "That's quite unusual in a town this size." "Not at all uncommon for charitable giving, Inspector. People prefer their generosity to be private. Nothing sinister in it." "No," Purbright agreed. "Very few things are sinister in themselves." Tubb laughed. It was a large, convincing laugh. He finished his pint, signaled for another, and turned back to Purbright with the expansive goodwill of a man who felt the conversation had gone very well. Which was, Purbright reflected, precisely the problem. Men who felt conversations had gone well tended not to review them carefully afterwards, and Tubb, in 20 comfortable minutes, had mentioned the charity fund, the Monday visit, the anonymous donation, and Featherby in that order, entirely of his own volition. He had mentioned Tuesday's telephone call to the bank, not at all. On the way out, Love murmured. "Brambling nearly said something." "Brambling," Purbright said, buttoning his coat against the evening air. "We'll say it eventually. People like Brambling always do. They store things up for crosswords, and then find the grid doesn't fit." The office of Featherby and Featherby occupied the first floor of number 9, Market Square, above a shop that sold curtain fabric and had been doing so, according to the faded gilt lettering above its door, since 1931. A narrow staircase led up from the street entrance, its walls hung with watercolors of the Suffolk coast that were competent without being interesting, which Purbright suspected was a deliberate choice. Oliver Featherby rose from behind his desk as they entered and extended a hand across it with the composed efficiency of a man who had been expecting this visit, had decided precisely how to receive it, and had rehearsed the whole business to a smoothness that was in its way more revealing than any agitation could have been. He was 53, lean, with close-cut grey hair and the kind of undemonstrative face that solicitors sometimes cultivate and sometimes simply arrive at after years of professional discretion. His desk held exactly what a desk in active use should hold: a legal pad, a pen, a single manila folder, and nothing else. On the windowsill behind him, a peace lily stood in a white ceramic pot, and managed to look both alive and somehow theoretical. "Inspector Purbright, please sit down." He glanced at Love with the brief, categorizing look of a man filing a reference. "I've been half expecting someone would call. Poor Gerald." "Yes," said Purbright, settling into the chair with the comfortable ease of someone who is nowhere particular to be. "A sad loss. Very sudden." Featherby folded his hands on the desk. "I was one of the last people to see him, of course. On the Tuesday, I imagine that's partly why you're here." It was, Purbright reflected, a beautifully positioned opening, the information volunteered early, before it could be extracted, and framed as something so obvious as to be almost administrative. He smiled amiably. If you wouldn't mind. Featherby's account was polished without being showy. He had gone to the bank at 2:30 for a meeting about estate planning matters on behalf of a client. He could not disclose the client's name, naturally, but the nature of the business was entirely routine. Past had been he paused here only for the word, not for the thought, focused. They had discussed the relevant matters. A member of staff had brought tea. Which member of staff? Purbright asked. The young woman at the counter. He said it without hesitation, and with just enough vagueness to suggest it was an unimportant detail. Purbright nodded. Miss Euphemia Crane, who had worked at that counter for 30 years, was not by most definitions a young woman. He stored this in the same quiet interior shelf where he kept things that needed to be looked at again later. And when you left, Mr. Pask was in perfectly good health. The sentence arrived intact, fully formed as though it had been waiting behind a door. He saw me to the office door himself. We shook hands. Mrs. Pole appeared with coffee at that point, setting the tray down with the precise care of a woman who has carried trays into this room for 12 years and still treats each occasion as potentially significant. She glanced at Featherby with an expression Purbright had seen in long-serving secretaries before, loyalty overlaid with something she had not quite named yet, even to herself. "Thank you, Dorothy," Featherby said. Then, when she remained a moment too long gathering cups, "That's all, thank you." His tone had sharpened, not dramatically, barely enough for anyone without Purbright's particular interest in unguarded moments to register. Featherby noticed it too, and softened the dismissal with a small smile that arrived a fraction of a second after the sharpness, like a correction made in the margin. Mrs. Pole withdrew. The peace lily continued its theoretical existence on the sill. Purbright accepted his coffee, and stirred it gently. "The Fenwhistle Community Betterment Fund," he said, in the tone of a man raising a mildly interesting topic at a dinner party. "You handle the legal administration, I believe." "I do, yes. Have done for 6 years. Councillor Tubb tells me there was a rather substantial anonymous donation in September, £22,000. Featherby took a sip of coffee. "The anonymous donation in September, was that structured through your office?" Here it was. 2 seconds, perhaps 2.25. Not long, in any objective measurement of time. But Featherby had been answering every previous question in under 1 second, with the smooth momentum of a man on a prepared track, and the pause announced itself against that rhythm as clearly as a missed step on a familiar staircase. "I handle a number of the fund's legal matters." "Yes," he said. They regarded each other for a moment across the desk with the mutual civility of two people who have understood each other perfectly and elected to continue on a surface that will hold them both for now. Purbright asked 2 further questions about the fund's annual audit arrangements, about the solicitor who had handled the second Featherby before the firm reduced to 1, and Featherby answered them with restored fluency. The meeting ended with handshakes and courteous expressions of willingness to assist further. On Market Square, the evening was coming in from the east, and most of the shops had already drawn their blinds. Love and Purbright walked back toward the car. They had gone perhaps 20 yards when Love glanced back at the first-floor window. "Lights still on," he said, "and he's on the phone." Purbright did not look back. "Yes," he said. "I thought he might be." He turned up his collar against the cooling air. "The question is only whether he's calling Tubb, or whether Tubb is already calling him." Saturday morning in Fenwhistle began with a market. 12 stalls arranged themselves around the lower half of the square with the weary familiarity of people who have been doing this every week for years and see no compelling reason to stop. Vegetables, cut flowers, a cheese stall that took its own seriousness very seriously, a man selling tools of uncertain provenance from the back of a van. The air carried the particular smell of autumn market days, damp canvas, frost-lifted soil, the distant suggestion of a hog roast that had not yet begun, and possibly never would. Purbright walked through it without hurrying, in the manner of a man with no defined purpose, which was not quite true. The pharmacy was on the corner of Church Lane and the High Street, and Dr. Ambrose Pell was at the collection counter when Purbright came in, tucking a paper bag into his coat pocket with the slightly guilty speed of a man who prefers that his own prescriptions remain private. He was 60, soft-featured, with the mild, unflappable manner of a GP who had delivered most of the town's population and attended the departure of a fair number of them, and who had long ago made his peace with the imprecision of medicine in a place where everyone also knew him socially. He had not, evidently made his peace with the current situation. "Inspector," he said it with a smile that arrived correctly but slightly late. "I had a feeling I might see you. Lovely morning for it," Purbright said, accepting this as the conversational overture it was. Pell held the door open for him, and they fell into step on Church Lane, which was empty enough at this hour to permit candor, should anyone have wanted it. "I hear you've been speaking to people," Pell said. "About Gerald." "One speaks to people," Purbright agreed pleasantly. "It's the bulk of the work, really." Pell walked a few paces in silence. "My certificate stands, Inspector. Cardiac failure in a man of that age and constitution is not. It requires no special explanation." "No, indeed." Purbright paused at a shop window displaying waterproof walking boots arranged in a pyramid. "Though I've always found foxgloves interesting, from a medical curiosity point of view, digitalis, specifically, terrible dose management. The difference between therapeutic and toxic is what? Remarkably small." He was not looking at Pell. He didn't need to. The reflection in the shop window was sufficient. Something passed across the doctor's face. Not guilt, precisely, but a kind of professional nausea, the expression of a man revisiting a decision he had made quickly and was now finding costly. "I didn't examine him at his desk," Pell said, quietly. "He'd already been moved to the back office when I arrived. There was a young man from the bank who found him. I was called afterwards." Purbright turned from the window. "Who called you?" "The bank." A pause. "Or someone at the bank." "I assumed it was Hadstock. I didn't ask." "The young man who found him, that would be Mr. Kelch." Pell looked slightly startled, as if the name had arrived too precisely. "I really don't know. I was there for 20 minutes at most." He stopped walking and squared himself with the mild dignity of a man delivering a considered position. "I signed what the evidence in front of me supported, Inspector. I signed what it was reasonable to sign." Purbright nodded with every appearance of agreement. "Of course," he said. "Thank you, Doctor." Mrs. Pamela Tubb was at the vegetable stall examining leeks with a focused displeasure that the stallholder appeared accustomed to. She was a trim, well-organized woman with observant eyes and the particular social bearing of someone who has spent 30 years beside a large personality and learned, through sheer self-preservation, to be precise where he was expansive. She saw Purbright coming, and arranged her expression into the pleasant neutrality of a woman who is perfectly happy to speak to police inspectors in public, as long as the conversation remains on agreeable terms. "Mrs. Tubb, lovely morning. It would be if the leeks were better." She surrendered to a paper bag with dissatisfied grace. "You've been talking to Reginald, I understand." "Yesterday." "Yes, at the golf club." She accepted her change and turned, tucking the bag under her arm. "Then you'll have had the full performance." The observation was made without malice, simply with the accuracy of long familiarity. "My husband is very fond of Gerald Pask in retrospect. He was considerably less fond of him in the fortnight before he died, when Gerald was apparently being what was the word Reginald used, inflexible." "About what did he say?" "No, she said it in a way that indicated she had tried and been refused. Reginald was in a terrible state that week, Inspector. Not his usual bluster, actual worry. The kind that makes a man eat his supper quickly and leave the table." She began walking, slowly, in the direction of the cheese stall. "I expect it's resolved itself, whatever it was. Reginald seems quite restored. And Mr. Boudhaupen, Mr. Boudhaupen, oh no, not topicas Hopaupen. Featherby?" Purbright asked, matching her pace. "Were they in contact during that period?" "Oliver is always in contact." Something cool, barely perceptible, entered her voice. "He and Reginald speak constantly. Oliver is very capable. Gerald trusted him, which I always thought was generous." The word hung in the October air between them like a small flag that neither party chose to lower or raise. "Thank you, Mrs. Tubb," Purbright said. She gave him a brief appraising look. "Do have some of the Bingham Blue, Inspector. The cheese, it's the only stall worth your time." The Fleece served sandwiches until 2 o'clock. And Brambling was occupying the corner table near the fire with a pint and a demeanor suggesting he had been there since at least 10. He waved Purbright over with the easy cordiality of a man who had wanted another conversation since the one at the golf club had been surgically interrupted. "Thought you'd find your way in here," he said. "Sit down. There's something I've been meaning to say." Purbright ordered a ploughman's and settled in. Brambling talked for 7 minutes, with the occasional digression corrected, about a friend of his who handled bookkeeping for 4 or 5 local organizations, one of which was the Betterment Fund. About 6 months ago, this friend, not a gossip mind you, just a thorough man, had mentioned that there were transactions in the fund accounts without legible donor trails, money arriving without paperwork, in amounts that seemed calibrated to sit just below the threshold that required additional documentation. I raised it with Reggie at the club, Brambling said, casually. He dismissed it so fast I almost got a draft, laughed and said my friend needed better glasses. He took a considered sip of his pint, which is when I started thinking it was probably worth remembering. And you remembered it well, Purbright said. I play golf at a 14 handicap, Inspector. I have a great deal of mental space to fill. He set his glass down. There's one other thing. Last Thursday evening, 2 days after Gerald died, I drove past Aldermere Road around 9 o'clock. Featherby's car was outside the Pask house. Dark so I couldn't see much. But that's a late hour for a sympathy call, I'd have thought. Purbright ate his ploughmans and said nothing for a moment, looking at the fire. 3 conversations. A doctor who had not examined a body at its location and could not now say who had called him. A wife who knew her husband had been frightened and had recently stopped being so. A man with a 14 handicap and a very good memory. He knew the shape of the motive now with some clarity. The how, the mechanism, the method, the specific moment remained just outside the frame. He suspected it was somewhere in the bank, and he suspected that the person who could put it there had not yet been asked the right question. The Barminster and County Bank on a Saturday afternoon was a different institution entirely from its weekday self. Without the transaction sounds, the queue, and the particular social theatre of a public counter, it subsided into something quieter and more honest, an old Edwardian building with good bones and insufficient heating, doing its best. The strip lighting in the back corridor hummed at a frequency just below complaint. Derek Quelch was in the filing room when Miss Crane showed Purbright and Love through. He was 24, recently confirmed as junior clerk following what Miss Crane had described to Purbright on the way in as a perfectly adequate probationary period, which in her lexicon represented considerable approval. He spent his Saturday mornings filing in the back room because Mr. Pask had suggested it 6 months ago as a way to manage the week's backlog, and Derek had continued the practice after Pask's death partly from professional diligence and partly, Purbright suspected, because the routine had become a way of not thinking too directly about what he'd found on Tuesday afternoon. He looked up from a manila folder when they came in. He was dark-haired, careful in his movements, and wore the expression of a man who has been rehearsing a conversation for 4 days without knowing exactly who it was with. "Mr. Quelch," said Purbright, leaning against the door frame with the relaxed posture of a man with no agenda. "I'm sorry to interrupt your Saturday. I just have a few questions if you don't mind. Nothing formal. Miss Crane's been kind enough to let us in." Behind him Miss Crane withdrew without comment, though not, Purbright noted, entirely out of earshot. Derek set the folder down and nodded. "I was wondering when someone would ask," he said. "I didn't know whether to say anything, whether it was relevant." "Why don't you tell me?" Purbright said pleasantly, "and I'll tell you whether it's relevant." Derek had found Mr. Pask at 4:15. He described this with the flat brevity of someone who has compressed a distressing memory into its minimum components. The office door ajar, the light on, Mr. Pask slumped sideways in his chair with one arm off the armrest. He had called out to Miss Crane immediately. Miss Crane had telephoned Dr. Pell. Derek had waited by the office door until the doctor arrived. "You moved Mr. Pask?" Purbright asked. "Before the doctor came?" "Into the back office, yes," Miss Crane said. She didn't think it appropriate for him to be visible through the glass panel, in case any customers. He paused, though the bank was closed by then. "It was just procedure, I think, wanting things managed properly." Love wrote the phrase back office, Miss Crane's instruction, and underlined it without particular emphasis. "The tea tray," Purbright said, moving without transition. "You collected it from his office that afternoon." Derek blinked, then nodded slowly. "About 3:30. After Mr. Featherby had gone, I knocked and Mr. Pask said to come in. He didn't look well. He was very pale and he'd loosened his collar. He said he was just tired. He waved me toward the tray. How did the cups look?" A pause. This was, Purbright sensed, the thing Derek had been carrying. One of them was nearly full, Derek said carefully, hardly touched. The other was empty. "I thought at the time that Mr. Pask must have drunk his quickly and not felt well after. People sometimes take too much tea when they're under pressure, I thought. But the one that was full had an odd ring at the bottom. When I washed up," he looked at Purbright directly, "a darker ring than tea usually leaves. I've washed those cups dozens of times. It wasn't the usual. Which cup was it? Do you remember its position on the tray? Derek thought with the genuine effort of someone consulting a reliable memory. The one nearest the window. That would have been the far side of the desk from Mr. Pask's chair, the visitor's side. Love's pen moved. Purbright said nothing for a moment, his gaze resting on the middle distance in the mild way of a man reviewing something pleasant. Then, before you went in to collect the tray, did you pass Mr. Pask's office at all during the meeting? Once, about 20 minutes in. I was coming back from the archive room. Did you hear anything? From inside the office? Derek looked faintly puzzled at the precision of the question. I heard a clink, a spoon on china, sort of, stirring. He hesitated. I remember thinking Mr. Featherby must take sugar, and the tray Miss Crane prepared. Did it include teaspoons? The puzzlement resolved into something more alert. Derek was not slow. He stood quite still for a moment. No, he said. Mr. Pask never took sugar. She always said it was unnecessary to put spoons out for him. She'd have known after 30 years. Yes, Purbright agreed. She would. Into the small silence that followed, the filing room offered only the hum of the strip light and the distant sound of the market outside packing itself away for another week. When Mr. Featherby left, Purbright said, keeping his voice entirely level, "Did you see him go?" "He passed my desk on the way to the door." Derek paused. He stopped for a second, just at the edge of the reception desk. He checked his inside pocket, patted it, almost. Then he went out. A longer pause. His face was, I don't know how to describe it. Not what you'd expect, coming out of a routine meeting. How would you describe it? Purbright asked. Derek considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Like a man who'd just done something difficult, he said finally, and found that it had worked. Purbright pushed himself off the doorframe. Thank you, Mr. Quelch. You've been extremely helpful, and you've done nothing wrong. He said this last with sufficient quiet weight that Derek, visibly, let go of something he had been holding since Tuesday afternoon. In the corridor, Love fell into step beside Purbright. No spoon, he murmured. No spoon, Purbright confirmed, and yet stirring. He pulled on his coat as they reached the front door. The cup nearest the window, Sid, on the visitor's side of the desk. Featherby prepared that cup himself, and then I rather think he moved it to Pask's side before the tea was poured. A tray is a convenient thing. Cups look identical. Nobody watches a man pick up a teacup. Love held the door. Outside, the last of the market stalls were folding their awnings in the thin afternoon light. We'll need the pathologist. We will. First thing Monday, I think. Purbright stepped out onto Market Square and glanced, just briefly, at the first-floor window of number 9. The frosted glass was dark today. The office closed. Though I suspect by Monday Mr. Featherby will have convinced himself that 4 days of silence is as good as safety. He was not entirely wrong about that. He was, however, wrong about how much time remained. Mr. Strickland from Ipswich had been efficient. By 9 o'clock on Monday morning, the Fenwhistle Community Betterment Fund's account records for the current financial year were laid out across the table in the bank's back office in 3 manila folders, ordered chronologically, accompanied by a brief and slightly breathless covering note explaining that the regional office was cooperating fully and hoped this would be resolved with minimum disturbance to the branch's normal operations. Purbright set the covering note aside and left the folders to Love, who had the particular relationship with columns of figures that some people have with crosswords, a settled, companionable patience that suggested he expected the numbers to yield eventually and was content to wait them out. Had Stock brought coffee and then remained, hovering at the edge of the room with the anxious helpfulness of a man who was not sure whether staying was appropriate, but was fairly sure leaving would feel worse. Purbright had decided Hadstock was harmless and occasionally useful, and allowed him to remain accordingly. Love opened the first folder. The fund's income was unremarkable. Donations from local businesses, a small grant from the county council, proceeds from the annual autumn fair, and in September, a single anonymous gift of £22,000, recorded in the ledger in Miss Crane's precise handwriting with a notation that read, "Donor, anonymous, per standing arrangement with O. Featherby, Solzers." "Per standing arrangement," Love murmured, and wrote it down. The expenditure side was where things became interesting. Between January and August, 5 separate payments had been authorized to a company called Fenland Property Services Limited, each accompanied by an invoice, each signed off by the fund's chair, Councillor Tubb, and countersigned by the fund's legal administrator, Featherby. The payments were for maintenance and improvement work, a bandstand roof repair in February, resurfacing of the library car park in April, installation of new play equipment in June and July, and repainting of the park railings in August. The total disbursed to Fenland Property Services across these 5 invoices came to £38,500. Love laid the invoices out in a row and studied them for a moment, with his head slightly tilted. "These descriptions are very thin," he said. "No contractor registration, no VAT number on 3 of them, and this one," he tapped the bandstand invoice, "doesn't list the materials used." "How much did the bandstand repair actually cost?" Purbright asked. Hadstock, gratified to be useful, was already at the filing cabinet. He returned with a folder of his own. "Here we financed the shortfall for the bandstand work. Local firm Alderton Brothers. The fund's contribution was settled directly." He found the relevant statement, £2,800, paid in March. Love did the arithmetic quietly. Fenland Property Services billed £8,500 for the same job, leaving a difference of £5,700, Purbright said, which passed through Fenland Property Services and arrived somewhere else. He looked at the invoices laid in their row. Multiply that pattern across 5 payments, and you have the approximate shape of £35,000 to £36,000 of charitable funds, redistributed to private benefit. Hadstock sat down in the nearest chair, with the expression of a man who has just understood something he would very much rather not have understood. Love was already on his telephone to Company's House. He was on hold for 4 minutes, during which Purbright read the September donation entry 3 more times, then stood and looked out of the small window at the back lane behind Market Square, where 2 pigeons were conducting a dispute over a piece of bread roll with the tedious persistence of parties who had each engaged legal representation. Love wrote something on his notepad and slid it across the table. Fenland Property Services Limited, incorporated the 14th of February this year. Sole Director T. W. Hooper. Hooper, Purbright said. Hadstock looked up from his chair. "Trevor Hooper. He does odd jobs. Garden clearances, that sort of thing. He's Councillor Tubbs' brother-in-law, married to his sister Margaret." "Is he?" said Purbright, without particular inflection. "Mr. Pask had a file out on his desk," Hadstock offered. He had the tone of a man releasing things he had been storing. "About 10 days before he died, a blue folder, not one of our standard ones. He'd put it together himself. I didn't see what was in it, but I saw the label, Fenland Property Services. I thought it was odd because they'd never had an account with us." He paused. "He put it away when I came in." "Did he? And on the Monday when Councillor Tubb visited, you mentioned a routine signing matter." Hadstock's hands settled on his knees. "It wasn't routine. I realize that now. They were in the office for 3/4 of an hour. At one point I heard, not an argument, but something more than a discussion." He searched for the right word with the care of a man who had been trained to be precise. "Intensity, the kind that goes quiet at intervals and then starts again." "Yes," said Purbright. That would have been Gerald Pask explaining what he had found and what he intended to do about it. The back office held this for a moment. Outside, the pigeons had resolved their dispute, or lost interest in it. The strip light hummed. Purbright's telephone rang. He answered it, listened without speaking for slightly over a minute, then said, "Thank you, that's very helpful," and rang off. He looked at Love, who was already watching him. "Cardiac glycoside," Purbright said, "consistent with digitalis toxicity, present in the tissue samples at a concentration that Dr. Pell's cursory examination in a back office would not have detected and was not, frankly, designed to detect." Love closed his notebook, aligned it precisely with the edge of the table and said nothing. "Well," said Purbright, pulling on his jacket, "now we know what we already knew." He picked up his hat from the back of the chair. "The question that remains, Sid, is not what happened to Gerald Pask or why. It is why Gerald Pask, a meticulous man who drafted a letter to his regional office, sealed it, and posted it himself in his dressing gown at 7 in the morning, chose, having done all that, to give Tubb and Featherby a further 48 hours. He looked at the records on the table, the figures, the invoices, the September entry in Miss Crane's handwriting, with the expression of a man who has read an interesting story and suspects the most important sentence is the one he has not yet found. "I think," he said, "that Mrs. Tubb may have some thoughts on that." She had telephoned the station at 8:30 on Monday morning, before Purbright had finished his first cup of tea, and asked for him by name with the directness of a woman who had spent the weekend deciding something and was now implementing it without ceremony. He arrived at the Tubb house on Hawthorne Rise at 10 o'clock, Love beside him, and was shown in by Mrs. Tubb herself rather than by any domestic arrangement, which told him she had wanted no intermediaries today. The sitting room was large and furnished with expensive restraint, the kind of room that suggested a decorator had been involved at some point, and personal taste had subsequently kept a respectful distance. There were no photographs of Reginald Tubb visible. Whether they were usually there and had been removed, or had never been there in the first place, Purbright could not determine, and felt that either possibility was equally informative. Mrs. Tubb sat across from him with a cup of coffee. She did not drink, and a composure that had clearly been assembled before he arrived and would remain in place for the duration. She was dressed, Purbright noted, with particular care for a Monday morning at home. She had the air of a woman attending a formal proceeding in her own sitting room. "I'll tell you what I know," she said, "in the order I know it. I'd prefer not to be interrupted." Purbright nodded once, settled back, and gave the floor entirely to her. She had noticed the money in March, deposits into their joint account, twice, in amounts of £3,000 and £4,000 respectively, which Reginald had explained as investment returns. She was the one who managed their household finances, had done so for 27 years, and she knew the shape of their investments closely enough to know that these were not investment returns. She had not pressed the matter at the time. She had, she said without apology, chosen not to press it. She had noted it and continued. The second thing she knew she had learned approximately 9 days before Pask died, when she asked Reginald directly whether there was a problem at the council. He had been distracted for a fortnight, and she disliked disorder in the house. He told her that Gerald Pask was being inflexible about a matter that did not require the degree of scrutiny Gerald was applying to it. He said Oliver was dealing with it. She asked what Oliver was dealing with. Reginald said, with the particular irritation of a man who considers his wife's questions a form of administrative overhead, "He's going to make sure Gerald understands the situation correctly." She had accepted this. Oliver was a solicitor. Solicitors clarified situations. On the Monday evening, the evening after Reginald returned from his long meeting with Pask at the bank, Oliver Featherby came to the house. She brought them both a whiskey in the study, as she was asked to, and left. She did not, however, go upstairs as was perhaps assumed. She stood in the hallway by the study door for a period of approximately 2 minutes. She reported what she heard with the precision of a woman who had revisited those 2 minutes many times in the intervening week. Featherby had said, "Gerald has already made up his mind. The letter won't wait." Reginald had said, "Then we have 1 day. You said you could manage it." Featherby had said, "I can manage it, but it has to be tomorrow." Purbright listened to this without expression. Love's pen made no sound. "I thought," Mrs. Tubb said, "that they were talking about a legal challenge, an injunction, something to prevent Gerald from submitting whatever he was going to submit. Oliver is a solicitor. Injunctions are a thing solicitors do. I told myself that is what they meant." She paused and something moved briefly behind her composed expression. Not regret exactly, but its first cousin. "I am aware that this requires a certain willingness to believe something convenient. And now?" Purbright asked. "Now I understand what was being managed," she said, "and what the deadline was for," she continued. On the Tuesday, Reginald had gone to the council offices in the morning and come home at 4 o'clock early, unusually, and had been, she said, extraordinarily calm. He had used that word himself, in fact. "Calm," he had said, when she asked how his day was. "It's all been sorted." He had then that evening cooked dinner. Pasta, she said, from scratch. He had not cooked dinner since 1998. In the silence that followed this detail, Purbright thought that of all the things he had heard in the past week, the pasta was perhaps the most damning. The equanimity of a man who has just ordered another man's death, and expresses it by making dinner. "Mrs. Tubb," he said, "I want to be sure I understand your position. You are telling me this freely, having taken the weekend to consider it." "I am telling you this freely," she confirmed, "having taken the weekend to consider it." There was no emotional decoration around the sentence. It stood alone and meant exactly what it said. "Thank you," Purbright said. "You've been very helpful." "I imagine I have," she said. He stood. Love gathered his notes with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that the exit from this room should be prompt. Mrs. Tubb remained seated, and did not see them to the door, which was a form of communication in itself. On Hawthorne Rise, a light rain had begun. Love walked a few paces, then said, "She's had all of that prepared, since at least Saturday," Purbright said. Possibly the moment she heard we'd requested the exhumation order. She's not sorry for him. No. Purbright turned up his collar. But I think she is sorry in some private, unfashionable way for Gerald Pask. She knew what her husband was. She stayed anyway. And a man died for it. He walked on. She's decided fury is something she can't afford right now, so she's doing the next available thing, which is being accurate. He glanced back at the house once, briefly. It's not nothing. Love considered this for a moment. The pasta detail, he said at last. Yes, said Purbright. The pasta detail. The Fenwhistle Arms offered a room that was clean, quiet, and equipped with a reading lamp whose angle could not be adjusted. Purbright had been working around this limitation for 5 days by moving the armchair to a position that the lamp had not been designed to illuminate, and which produced a satisfactory result at the cost of a slight draught from the window. He sat in it now, past 10 o'clock on Monday evening, with his notebook open on his knee and the particular quality of stillness around him that descends when the day's conversations have stopped and the mind begins, without being asked, to arrange what it has accumulated. He read his notes from the beginning, not selectively, not in search of anything, simply in order, from the first page. He had learned at some point in a career that had involved a great many notebooks, that the useful thing was rarely the item you were looking for. It was the item adjacent to it, which only became visible once you had stopped hunting. He read Mrs. Pask. He went to the box at the end of the road himself, rather than leaving it for the collection. The early hour, the dressing gown, the unusual errand. Gerald never went outside in his dressing gown. Not once in 26 years. He read his note from Strickland, postmarked Tuesday. First post, he must have sent it that morning, before he came into work. He sat with this for a moment, then he turned back to his notes from Mrs. Tubb, found the relevant passage, and read it once more. Gerald has already made up his mind. The letter won't wait. He put the notebook down on the arm of the chair, and looked at the unadjustable lamp. The letter won't wait. Not Gerald will write a letter. Not Gerald is threatening to report this, but the letter won't wait. Present tense. A letter that already existed. A letter in a state of readiness that precluded delay. Featherby had said this on Monday evening, after Tubb had returned from his confrontation at the bank, which meant that by Monday evening, Featherby believed, knew, or was sufficiently certain to act upon it, that the letter was already written, already done, waiting only for a postbox, and Pask had posted it the following morning, in his dressing gown, before 7 o'clock, before Miss Crane had unlocked the branch, before the world had properly started. Purbright picked up the telephone and dialed the number for Strickland's direct line, which he had written on the inside cover of his notebook. Strickland answered on the third ring with the alert tone of a man who had been expecting calls at inconvenient hours, and had resigned himself to it. The letter, Purbright said. When exactly did it arrive at your office? A brief pause, the sound of papers. Wednesday morning. First delivery, about 8:30, and you called me on Friday. We needed to verify the tea. Yes, we needed to be certain before involving. Of course, Purbright said. Thank you. He set the receiver down and remained still for a moment, doing the arithmetic that did not require numbers. Tuesday morning, the letter posted. Tuesday afternoon, Featherby's visit. Pask, at some point in that meeting, with the particular directness of a man who has already acted and sees no reason for pretense, would have told Featherby, I've written to Ipswich. It went this morning. Whatever you came here to discuss, you should know that it is already done. And Featherby, who had come to that meeting with something in his jacket pocket that he later checked at the reception desk on the way out, with the expression Derek Quelch had described as a man who had done something difficult and found it had worked, had proceeded anyway, not to prevent the letter. The letter was already in the postal system, making its unremarkable way toward Ipswich in a Royal Mail sorting bag, indifferent to everything that was about to happen in a first-floor office on Market Square. Featherby had poisoned Gerald Pask not to stop a disclosure, but to remove the man who would confirm it, elaborate it, stand behind it in person, and give it the weight of a living witness, except of course that Strickland had telephoned Purbright, not despite Pask's death but because of it. The letter and the death, arriving in sequence, had made the combination impossible to dismiss. A living Pask with his letter might have been managed through institutional channels, slowed, questioned, referred. A dead Pask with his letter was a different matter entirely. The murder had not suppressed the disclosure, it had ensured it. Purbright sat with this for a while, in the way one sits with a fact that is both complete and bleak. Gerald Pask in his last hours, waving Derek away, saying he was tired, sitting quietly at his desk while something irreversible proceeded through his system, had known that the letter was already gone. He had kept separate as he kept all things separate. The knowledge that what needed doing had been done from whatever was happening to him now. He had been, even at the end, a private man. This was not consoling. It was simply true. Purbright opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote 2 names, a time, and a single instruction in his methodical, unspectacular hand. Then he telephoned Love. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "early, I want Featherby and Tubber approached simultaneously, separate officers to each within the same 5-minute window. Tubbs' first instinct, when he sees us coming, will be to telephone Featherby. Featherby's first instinct, once telephoned, will be to do something irreversible with his client files." "Understood," said Love, in the tone of a man who had been half expecting this call and had already mentally set his alarm. 7:30. 7:30, Purbright confirmed. "And Sid, it might be worth letting Hadstock know that Miss Crane should open the bank herself tomorrow, just to preserve the routine." He paused. "She'll know something is happening. She always does. Should I explain? I shouldn't think she needs us to." He put the phone down. Outside, Fenwhistle was quiet in the way of small towns after 10, not silent but settled, with only the occasional car on the high street and the distant sound of the Fleece's doors opening and closing. A perfectly ordinary Monday night in a town where nothing, as a rule, was wrong. He closed the notebook and turned off the lamp that could not be adjusted, and the room was dark. The door to Featherby and Featherby was unlocked at 7:25 on a Tuesday morning, which was unusual. The curtain fabric shop below was shuttered. Market Square was empty except for a delivery van outside the Fleece, and a single pigeon conducting a private survey of the cobblestones with the methodical indifference of someone with no fixed agenda. Purbright went up the narrow staircase alone, past the competent watercolors of the Suffolk coast, and pushed the office door open without knocking. Featherby was at his desk in his overcoat. He had not, Purbright suspected, removed it since arriving, which may have been early that morning or may have been considerably earlier than that. In front of him was a cup of tea. Neither man looked at it directly, but both were aware of it in the way that objects sometimes make themselves conspicuous by being exactly what they are. The peace lily on the windowsill had been watered recently. Its leaves were very clean. "Mr. Featherby," Purbright said. "Inspector." Featherby's voice was entirely level. He had arrived at this moment by some interior route that had apparently exhausted all available emotion several days ago, leaving only a composed and functional quiet. "I've been expecting you since Friday evening. In all honesty, I rather thought you'd have come sooner. I wanted to be certain," Purbright said. "It seemed the least I could do." He explained in the measured and courteous tone he used for all such explanations, what Featherby was being arrested for, and what would follow. Featherby listened without interruption, without objection, with the focused attention of a professional man being briefed on a matter of consequence. When Purbright had finished, Featherby was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, with a precision that suggested the question had been waiting for some time, "The letter, did it arrive before he died?" "Yes," Purbright said. "He posted it himself. Tuesday morning. It was in Ipswich by Wednesday." The pause that followed this was of a different quality from the efficient silences Featherby had deployed throughout the previous week. It was a pause in which a man absorbed the full geometry of his own error. "He told me," Featherby said at last. He was looking at the desk surface, which offered nothing in particular but appeared to require examination. "During the meeting, he said he had already written, that it was done. He straightened a pen that was already straight. I thought he was constructing a position, trying to make himself seem more secure than he was. Gerald Pask was a methodical man, but I believed that in this instance he was buying time. He looked up. I misjudged him." "Yes," Purbright said. "I think you did." Featherby stood, reached for his briefcase by the long habit of 30 years, then registered what he was doing and set it back against the desk. He straightened his coat instead, which was already straight, and came around from behind the desk with the composure of a man who has decided that the manner of this moment is the last thing he can still govern. The 2 officers who had come up the stairs behind Purbright were very quiet and very professional, and the business was concluded without drama, which was as it should be. Mrs. Pole arrived at 8:05 to find 2 uniformed officers in the outer office, and no Featherby. Purbright was seated at the secretary's desk, completing paperwork, and stood when she came in, which she appeared to find unexpectedly considerate. "The office will need to be secured," he told her. "Someone from the regional fraud team will be in contact about the files." She set her bag down slowly and looked at the inner office, the empty desk, the peace lily in its pot. "I thought something was wrong," she said. "I've thought so for a week." She was silent for a moment, absorbing the particular flavor of being right about something one had hoped to be wrong about. Then, with the practical resolution of a woman for whom the next available action was always preferable to dwelling, she crossed to the small kitchen and filled the kettle. "Well," she said, to no one specifically, "there it is." Love telephoned at 8:15. Tubb had, as anticipated, attempted to reach Featherby twice within the first 30 seconds of the officer's arrival at Hawthorne Rise. The second attempt was still in progress when Love gently removed the handset from his grip. Tubb had then sat down very heavily at his kitchen table and said, with a flatness remarkable in a man of his habitual volume, "I see." The same two words, separately arrived at, identical in form. It was, Purbright reflected, perhaps the most honest exchange the two men had ever shared. He passed through Market Square at 9 o'clock on his way to the car. The bank was open, its door freshly polished, its transaction sounds already resumed. At her counter, Miss Crane was attending to a customer with the focused efficiency of 30 years' unbroken practice. She looked up as Purbright passed the window. He gave a single small nod. She returned it with equal economy and turned back to her work. The customer, who had been watching the exchange with mild puzzlement, decided it was none of his business and signed his form. They drove out of Fenwhistle on the Ipswich Road, past the church with its leaning tower, past the War Memorial with its surplus sarce, past the level crossing on Mill Lane where the gate opened 8 seconds after the signal, as it had always done, as no one had ever thought it necessary to mention. Love, after a mile or so, said, "Do you think he knew what Featherby was going to do? Pask, I mean." When he posted the letter, Purbright considered the question with the respect it deserved. Outside, the flat East Anglian landscape offered its usual combination of breadth and restraint: wide skies, contained fields, everything exactly as far as it was and no further. "I think," he said, "that once the letter was gone, he regarded what happened to him personally as a separate matter. He was very good at keeping things separate." "That's not quite an answer," Love said. "No, but it's the one that fits." They drove on in the companionable quiet of two people who have finished a thing and find themselves, for the moment, entirely satisfied with silence. What the bank manager had refused to disclose in the end was not the embezzlement. He had disclosed that promptly, thoroughly, and by first post. What he had refused to disclose to Tubb on the Monday, when the confrontation was at its most heated, was that the disclosure was already made, that the letter was written, sealed, and waiting, that everything Tubb feared had already been set in motion, and there was nothing left to threaten or to prevent. It was perhaps the most consequential silence of Gerald Pask's professional life. He had kept it with the same unremarkable discipline he applied to everything, separately, privately, and without unnecessary explanation. Fenwhistle, in the end, had been right about one thing. It was a town where nothing needed to be said twice. It simply had to be known, which was a different matter entirely, and which on balance suited everyone perfectly well.